I want to talk about one of my favorite topics. It's um, it's what I call living with an undefended heart, and I have been looking at this and investigating what this means for many, many, many years, and it's kind of the lens through which I see the world. And I think I think it's always an important reflection, and I people have asked me over the years why someone would even want to live with an undefended heart, especially with all the challenges, the violence and the hatred and the fear and the 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 hatred and all the rise again of racism and homophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, all the stuff, anti-LGBTQ, everything that's going on. Wouldn't it make sense to, you know, put up some walls and armor around our hearts? And actually, I think it's more important than ever that we don't shut down our hearts and that we absolutely do what we can to keep them open, you know. And then it's not even the world, it's our own personal experiences, the messiness of our own lives that we all have to a greater or lesser extent, you know. And what I want to say is that living with an undefended heart does not mean we don't have boundaries. This is something that people think they're the same thing, and they're not. It doesn't mean that we just open ourselves up and go, okay, whatever, because Buddhism, meh. That's not what it is. It's really a wise and courageous way to be in the world. It invites us to turn towards the awfulness, and the joy. It's not just the awfulness, but we also turn towards the joy. We turn towards everything, the full messiness of the world, and hold whatever's happening with equanimity. Um, it's really important, to turn towards. That's kind of what the gist of the meditation was, to allow things to just be as they are and watch the tendency to react and instead just respond. And I saw a quote from James Baldwin that I think it really kind of sums this up. And he said, "I am terrified by the moral apathy and death of heart that is happening in my country." And he wrote this or said this like 50 or 60 years ago, and we can say the same thing today. And it's very current that this moral apathy and death of heart is really foundational to so many of our problems. Because when we shut down our hearts, it's a lot easier to get lost in greed and hatred and delusion and ignorance. And when we open our hearts, we have this awareness, this connection with others. It's really important. We develop an intimacy with our experience, with ourselves, with our experience, and we can be open and see what's going on. We're not in denial about a situation. We're fully cognizant of the reality of the world, and we're not turning away from it. It reminds me of the Bodhisattva of compassion. Guan Yin is my favorite embodiment of that Bodhisattva image, and she is open to hear the tears of the world. She's not overwhelmed by it, and that's practice of equanimity. In equanimity, in compassion, compassion, karuna, means we're touched by our heart quivers when we experience or recognize the suffering of others, but we're not overwhelmed by it. There's an equanimity, a balance. And so recognizing that this is, I think, a place that we want to get to. And I really think it's part of what the Buddha never said undefended heart. There was never any phrase in that, but I think it's really the gist of what he was saying. We don't say no. We don't, there's no aversion to anything. Somebody asked me that is about the armoring of the heart. And I said, any kind of armoring of the heart is a form of aversion, which is a form of, one of the three defilements, the three poisons: greed, hatred, aversion. It's saying no to what is. And so to cultivate this undefended heart, this open heart, we have to recognize how we armor ourselves. That's always the first thing. What gets in the way? What's keeping us from this capacity to be open to this moment? What does our armor look like? You know, how do we defend ourselves? What are our walls? And often it's fear-based, you know, fear or craving, or we get into these fixed views about how things should be, how people should behave. There's a rigidity, you know, about things, which is also fear-based. If we can get things to line up just perfectly all the time, then we don't have to worry. But that becomes a fundamentalist view, a rigid view, which is not very open. It's quite armored. And I was thinking about this a few weeks ago, that it's walking around in a suit of armor is really clumsy and not very suitable. And oftentimes this armor shows up as the hindrances. If you know, the teachings of the hindrances, the craving, wanting something different, not wanting something, restlessness, worry, where we're constantly agitated about everything. I heard a thing the other day on TV, and it's like, from 1 to 10, how many people worry about, you know, the future? And the answer was 10 out of 10. And it's like, yikes. And I get that, but how, you know, it's like understanding the reality, but not to be lost in that what if only, what's going to happen, la 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 la. That's lost in delusion a lot of times, lost in a fantasy. And then the flip side of that, of restlessness and worry, is dullness and torpor, you know, checking out. It's like, you know, we have so many ways we can check out. And then doubt, just not believing any of this is going to be anything other than crap. And one of the, Brene Brown wrote a book many years ago called Daring Greatly, and she talks about living wholeheartedly, which I think is the same thing. It's living with an undefended heart, which is about, and she talks about being vulnerable, you know, and she talks about the shields we've developed. She calls them shields. And one of them that I can really relate to, and I think I've mentioned before, I mentioned a lot, is this idea of foreboding joy. That's, we do not allow ourselves to experience joy because we know it's going to end. And we don't want to have to deal with the ending of our happiness because it's going to hurt. You know, I actually had the thought 30 something years ago, when my husband and I first talked about getting married, was, you know what? He's going to die one day and I don't want to have to deal with that. It would be easier just to walk away. That's an armor. That's a shield. You know, all of those types of things are postponing or not allowing ourselves to feel the joy of the moment because we're worried about the future. So that's a denial of reality. Perfectionism is another one. I'm kind of a recovering perfectionist. I still have those tendencies, but if we get everything perfect, nothing can happen. It's all good, but the problem is it's impossible. So it's a continual cycle of failure. You know, we try to be perfect. We can't be perfect. We try harder. We beat ourselves up more, or blame. And so that's armor that's just goes nowhere. And then numbing. She talks about numbing too, which is very much like the dullness and torpor and the hindrances. We just can check out alcohol, drugs, gambling, sex. Our society provides multiple ways to numb ourselves. Social media. I mean, it's all there. We can do whatever we want to numb ourselves. Those are shields from reality. That shuts ourselves down. Also, another one that I was thinking about is this idea of self-sufficiency, this inability to ask for help. It kind of is sibling to perfectionism. It's like, no, I got it. That's a wall keeping people out. And I'm sure you can add your own way. Busyness, that's a real thing in our society. It's like we're constantly busy, always going, running, doing. I don't have to feel like, don't have time, gotta go, la, la, la. So to watch how we armor ourselves is really important. And to, again, recognize that so many of these are driven by fear. A fear we won't get something we want, or we'll lose something we have, or it's going to hurt. It's what the Buddha talks about in the Second Noble Truth, that we want things, to be pleasant. We are not okay with discomfort, and we cling to what we think will bring us pleasure. And to cling is to suffer, because it's not permanent. Nothing is permanent. So when we put a stake in the ground and say, this is the way it is, we're going to arrive and then we're going to be done, it's not going to happen. But we chase it, chase it, chase it. And the problem is, when we armor ourselves, when we create these walls, these barriers, we think we're keeping out the bad stuff, but we're keeping out the good stuff as well. And nothing gets in or out. We're incredibly isolated, and it can be really lonely. Our defenses don't work. Perhaps they've worked for a while. And, at some point, we developed these defenses because we really needed them. They served a purpose at some point in time. It was growing up for me, I knew it was really important to keep my mouth shut. Just don't say anything. It's going to end a lot better if you don't open your mouth. And so I did that, but then I carried that for decades, much longer than it served a purpose. And I didn't know how to open my mouth. In times and places, I needed to open my mouth. I needed to say something, and I couldn't, because I had this barrier. I had this wall, this shield. This will keep me safe. And it was debilitating at times, not being able to face things. I would rather run 1,000 miles away than have to face something uncomfortable. And that was like some deep, deep, deep conditioning. Those are the deep biases we have in our lives that drive how we move through the world. Sometimes we're aware of them, sometimes we're not. And I think that's what's really important, is to begin to recognize those ones that we don't see, those emotions that are down there that we've become very adept at keeping hidden. There's a book called Deep Diversity, and it talked about our emotions that exist at a covert level and an overt level. And so when we get angry, when there's anger or happiness or sadness, the emotion has to break through our personal threshold, which is our defense, before we become aware of experiencing it. They're unconscious until they get past the threshold, that defense. And if we're not paying attention, or if we're not consciously working to see them, they influence our behavior, our thoughts, and our choices. They drive us to behave in ways that we don't know why we're behaving, And as I said, so much of this comes from our conditioning, our childhood, our experiences in school, in our families, in society. We're told things that we're not good enough. We're this, we're that, we're not this. And society marginalizes so many people on so many different factors, and we hear all those things, and it impacts us. And Lama Rod Owens said that, we're not responsible for that. We can't take responsibility for what happened to us as children. We can't take responsibility for a society that oppresses us in particular ways, but we're responsible for working with that, working with how it impacts us. That's what our work is, because if we don't, we can often cause harm to ourselves and others. Anger can be a defense, but carrying anger around is not a wise way to be in the world. It's toxic. And it creates a separation, judging, comparing, this armoring creates a separation from others rather than a connection. These defenses we have are a denial of reality. So we're living in delusion. We're saying no to what is. And our perception is distorted, and delusion in the mind causes us to think we need armor. So if we begin to chip away at this delusion, we're also chipping away at this armor. And so that's the work, to identify this armor, identify there is armor, and then to be willing to chip away at it. So how do we do that? I wish it were easy. It's a slow process. It's a slow process. We want to be over it. There's got to be a book that says 10 weeks to an undefended heart, but there isn't. I'm sure there is, but I mean, 10 weeks. You didn't get here in 10 weeks, so it's not going to end in 10 weeks. You know, we all want the microwave miracle. So how do we get there? We don't just, you know, it's not like ripping a Band-Aid off. Someone told me once she was terrified of this idea. And it can be really terrifying. What do we do without our defenses? How do we show up in the world? And so we just start where we are, slowly, slowly, slowly. You know, maybe just allowing the idea in. Oh, maybe this is something I want to investigate. And that's how it has started for me. I heard the phrase somewhere, and then at a New Year's Eve intention, it just popped into my head, and I said, oh, my intention for the year is to live with an undefended heart. And I just kind of let it sit there. And then somebody at some point after that asked me if I would do a Dharma talk on what an undefended heart is. And so then I had to say, what am I even talking about when I say that? And then I did a talk, and then I went, oh, it's not just a Dharma talk. It's actually a way to move through the world. And so that's where you start. Maybe you see the things that are causing you dukkha today. Like for me, one of the very obvious ones was that inability to say what I needed to say in important moments. You know, how am I, where's my suffering? Where am I running head up into things? Where's my dukkha? Or if I find myself, you know, numbing out, playing solitaire for 8 hours, oh, I'm numbing out. What's underneath this? Being willing to ask the question, what is this? You know, that's what we do. We begin to recognize the hindrances. This is where mindfulness comes in. This is where our practice comes in. We sit. We're willing to turn towards what comes up, especially when it's challenging, because we've spent years and become very adept at stuffing those things down, pushing them away. You know, we let go of the judging mind. We see how we separate ourselves from others. You know, and you bring kindness and compassion into the mix. You begin to soften. The Visuddhimagga, which is this 5th century treatise that kind of systematizes the Buddha's teaching, really systematized the idea of the heart practices. The heart practices are really helpful. The Buddha talked about metta, and the Metta Sutta is in the suttas. The Metta Sutta is in the original, the Pali Canon and the discourses. But this idea of the categories and such is a later addition from the Visuddhimagga, written by Buddhaghosa. But one of the things it talks about metta, loving kindness, is that it melts these psychic pollutants. I love that phrase. Metta melts the psychic pollutants. And I think when armor, you can think of as one of those things that pollutes our mind into thinking and believing a certain set of things that are not true. I would consider our defenses, this armor we put up, as psychic pollutants. You know? And I remember when I first started turning towards this stuff, it was really hard. And I think I have this line, and I think it's from Jack Kornfield. He said, the mind gradually yields up memories that are terrifying and that we have kept hidden. And we turn towards them. And when I was first working with this stuff, when I was really seriously getting into my practice, this stuff, it didn't take long because it was like right there. It just needed a little mindfulness to go, hello. And when someone was asking me, well, can you touch that? Can you be with that? Where is it in the body? You know, where's the emotion in the body? Where's the feeling in the body? Is it in the chest? Is it in the belly? And mine was kind of hanging out right in my chest. And they said, does it have a shape? Does it have a texture, a color? And I had this sense, it was very clear to me that my heart was encased in this metal sphere that was made from some alien material, so nothing on earth could get through. That's what the image was. And I went, that sounds about right. The walls were so thick because I was not interested in feeling the feelings. I didn't even know what they were until I really started being still for them. And it goes back to a lot of my dad dying when I was 5, and nobody ever talked about grief, and nobody ever talked about any of that stuff. And so that stuff was all in there, just kind of bouncing, you know, pinball machine, whack-a-mole, all those amusement park things. It was like all in there. And it's like, if I just stuff it in here, I never have to feel about it. But as I said earlier, that never works. It oozes out at some place. And so we have to be willing to turn towards. So that was the place that was bringing me the most suffering. And that's where I had to work on right then and there. And then as we become, so that was a defense that I was willing to open towards. So that's kind of opened up. And then through the years, there are these other walls that I have hit, that we all hit. And we go, okay, here's another wall. Can I be with it? So we don't just like open up the heart and go, la la, here I am. We chip away slowly, slowly, slowly as we can. There's no judgment in this practice. It's really, we do it as we can. So for me, there's still some defenses left, you know, but there's a lot more that are gone. And there's a lot of freedom in there. When we don't have to hide behind these defenses, there's a tremendous amount of freedom. There's a connection. But when we can start bringing that compassion to our own sorrow, our own suffering, oh my goodness. The breath we can take, finally, it's like we've been holding our breath our whole lives for like fear that stuff's going to show up. No, we can be with suffering. We can be with sadness. There's a quote I saw from Eric Fromm, and he said, one cannot be responsive to the world without being saddened very often. There's sadness, first noble truth, you know, there's suffering. If we say no to this, we can't be connected to the world. We're going to be disconnected. And we have to recognize our interconnectedness. No, we have to recognize how we're all part of this shared humanity. The compassion we can offer to ourselves, we then begin to recognize we can offer to others. And how do we work towards living in a world where there's no harm being caused? That's a really important question, because there's so much harm in so many places. How do we become a piece of that non-harming and working towards, you know, ending the pain, ending the suffering, ending the extra level? There's sadness, you know, first noble truth, or the 5 remembrances, where all of the nature to grow old, get sick and die, and everything we love will go away someday. To recognize that's part of being a human being, but there's all this extra level of suffering that we place on ourselves. And I read a book, I read Pema Chodron's book, Start Where You Are, which is the phrase I say a lot, practically, I think 30 years ago. And I lent it to someone, and a couple of years after that, and never got it back. But somebody just gifted it to me because I said that enough in the classes that I thought I'd never got it back, and somebody sent it to me. So thank you. But in here she talks about it that, and I want to read a passage because it's really, I couldn't say it any better than she says it. She doesn't explicitly say undefended heart, but that's really what she's talking about. And she says, when you begin to touch your heart or let your heart be touched, you begin to discover that it's bottomless, that it doesn't have any resolution, that this heart is huge, vast, and limitless. You begin to discover how much warmth and gentleness is there, as well as how much space. Your world seems less solid, more roomy and spacious. The burden lightens. In the beginning, it might feel like sadness or a shaky feeling accompanied by a lot of fear, but your willingness to feel the fear, to make fear your companion, is growing. You're willing to get to know yourself at this deep level. After a while, this same feeling begins to turn into a longing to raze, R-A-Z-E, all the walls, a longing to be fully human and to live in your world without always having to shut down and close off when certain things come along. It begins to turn into a longing to be there for your friends when they're in trouble, to be of real help to this poor, aching planet. Curiously enough, along with this longing and this sadness and this tenderness, there's an immense sense of well-being, unconditioned well-being, which doesn't have anything to do with pleasant or unpleasant, good or bad, hope or fear, disgrace or fame. It's something that simply comes to you when you feel that you can keep your heart open. It's this sense of equanimity, this sense of being right where you are. You don't have to hide. You know, we're not afraid of that one thing. We don't have to keep our hands up, hiding behind them. There's such a freedom. We can be touched by the world. We're not overcome by it. We let our heart quiver, you know, with the sadness and the joy. Really important to recognize that there's joy too. And, you know, so we do this slowly. We do this with kindness, with gentleness. We're willing to work towards this, recognizing it takes time, but just a little chipping away. You know, and I was giving this talk last night at my 5 o'clock class. I do a 5 o'clock Saturday group, and somebody asked about the boundaries again. I mentioned them earlier, and doesn't this mean, you know, we just open ourselves up? And it's like, no, this undefended heart is a wise heart. It's not what Pema Chodron calls, we don't have idiot compassion. It's like, okay, whatever, like I said before. It's like, no. What's the line? I will invite you into my heart, but not into my house. We have a clarity. There's a compassion, but there's also a wisdom. It's wise compassion. We see what's happening. We see if somebody is causing harm. We don't shut our hearts to them. We wish them well, and we hold them accountable. People are held accountable for what they do. You know, it's not just a willy-nilly open-heartedness. It's like a fierce compassion. It's like, no, you need to shape up. It's saying what needs to be said. Wise speech is not just not saying, not lying or not telling, you know, being truthful. It's about saying what needs to be said. Really important, this fierce compassion, this fierce heart. In the Mahayana tradition, they talk, and which is Pema Chodron, she talks about the warrior training, and it's this wise warrior who is willing to take on the injustice and the crap in the world to end that. So there's this wisdom. We don't just drop all our boundaries. That's not what this means. So we have an open heart. We can touch the world. We can touch our own sorrow, our own sadness. and heal in ways that we couldn't imagine when we're hiding in the closet or wherever we're hiding. So thank you so much, my friends. I invite you to investigate this journey of living with an undefended heart. I'm so grateful that I heard those. I didn't make that phrase up. I heard that somewhere and it kind of moved in, and then somebody else asked me about it. And then I just kind of said, okay, let's go for this ride, and still working on it. And so thank you. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate your generosity of spirit. So thanks. And any thoughts, any questions, comments? What's your relationship to an undefended heart? All right. Well, I want to thank you again so much, my friends, for being here. It's always a delight to be with you. And I think that's all I have for today. So now I'll put the host hat back on and say thanks everyone for being here. And I've put again in the chat the link to the page where you can offer Donna as a support for ICD, and that supports everybody as we move through these days. And yeah, so thanks everyone, and remembering that we don't just practice for our own benefit, but we practice for the benefit of all beings. So may all beings be at ease. May all beings be free. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your evening.